growing up in Africa, the rule is you go to school, you get good grades, and when you're of the age and you graduate high school and your grades are good enough, you get sent anywhere you want to and to go in the world, right? So ultimately, the options are really Europe, Canada, or the U.S. So I have our family. We're six, right? So six kids. So five siblings. I'm the youngest. Brother graduated his high school, had, ridiculously good grades. Dad's like, you can go anywhere. He goes to Canada. He goes to Montreal, right? This is
Mm.
like back in the 90s. My sister, good grades, graduates. Where do you want to go? I want to go to the United States. Send her to the United States. Um, but ultimately, over time, when it got to me, like by the time we moved to the United States, it was just me and my two brothers. So the rest of the family was really already like in the States or in Canada, right? So it's like it was ultimately a decision that my parents made because they were also nearing retirement, right? Like my dad
Mhm.
was getting old and he's like, all right, I think it's time to settle down. So ultimately, everybody else, like I was what, in sixth grade or seventh grade, something like that. So ultimately, it was an easy decision to say, hey, let's move them over so they can get into the system early enough so they can actually, like do well with the language, right? With, learning English and get involved in sports and anything that had to do with academia versus actually just waiting until I graduated for us to actually move. So ultimately, it was a decision that was a great decision, obviously, because who wouldn't want to move to the States, right? It's like I was a big fan of hip hop, obviously growing up, and at the time, Lil Jon was like hot like fish grease, right? So it's
Mm.
like I was like, dang, I'm headed to the States, where everything is happening. So I was very excited, but ultimately, it was just a decision that my parents made for just to give us a better life.
And where did they go? Which part of the
Oh
US?
man, oh man, so. I was thinking it was going to be like very modern and very like, like New York City and, like, or Atlanta, very
Yeah.
vibrant, or like Los Angeles or something, right? They chose Oregon,
Hmm.
Eugene, Oregon.
Oh yeah,
And
I have good friends in Eugene. I've actually been a bunch of times, but it's not as glamorous as those other spots for sure.
I do not kid you, 12, 13-year-old major just looking from the plane, looking down at Eugene as the plane's about to land. And I'm like, my city back in Lome in Togo had way more skyscrapers than this
Hmm.
place.
Oh yeah.
And I'm just like, dang, really? But funny part is I grew to love Oregon. Like I love going back to Oregon, obviously. I grew up in Eugene. I went to school in Eugene and I ended up graduating and was fortunate to get a athletic scholarship at Portland State where I did my post-secondary studies. Um, but yeah, no, the very first like 2 years in Oregon in general was tough. It was tough because it didn't feel like America to me.
Hmm.
But it's crazy because the older I get, the more I realize the value of like that environment of the Pacific Northwest in general. It's so lush, but the quality of life there is actually really good. It might not be like vibrant, and I mean Portland now is, right? It's very
Yeah.
vibrant, especially with culinary and cultures and stuff like that. But I mean Eugene, oh man, that was like you could bike from one end of Eugene to the other.
Oh yeah.
It's like, but the older I get, the more I'm appreciative of it, and it's also, the birthplace of Nike, obviously, right? So,
Hmm.
well, technically, the birthplace of Nike is Portland State, my alma mater, but they gave all the money to the Ducks at the University of Oregon. But a lot of history over in Eugene, Oregon, obviously, and I it's one of those things where I was like, when you're a kid, obviously you question it, but as you get older, you're like, okay, I see why you made this decision. It was safe. It was a
Hmm.
great education system. You never had to worry about us getting in trouble, well, in trouble like that, like most places that are like super fast and urban and stuff. And also, it was affordable, like at least back then. Now, different story.
Yeah, like I assume most of the country and my country, sadly. And I'm curious what exactly you briefly mentioned or touched on it, but what exactly was that transition like from living in Africa to at grade 6, which is maybe what 11, 12? That's a pretty hard age to just
Yeah.
come from a totally different world into the US, even a place like Eugene, and just start life there, right? So what was that like at that age?
My siblings made it very fun. It's like full house. a lot to
Nice.
do, right? But it was really cool, man. Obviously, learning of the language was hilarious, and like I could tell you countless stories of funny things that I said just because I didn't really, I couldn't grasp the you can learn the language, right? But you can say stuff and it's wrong, right? Or
Hmm.
like it's
Yeah.
like things that you really wouldn't say, right? And ultimately, conversational English was different than Google Translate English, or like my translator
Yeah.
English. And but ultimately it was really fun. Obviously you go through, the some of the similar things that a lot of people go through as far as, prejudice and all these different things. Like, I've definitely heard the whole like, wow, you're from Africa? Like, so you guys like live in trees and stuff? I definitely heard a bunch of that, like,
Yeah.
when I moved in, and I don't blame them. It's like it's probably what you see on TV and stuff, but honestly, it was really cool. I was fortunate to have arrived in a community that really opened their arms and really embraced us. When we moved to Eugene, obviously it's like it's polarizing, right? It's like, hey, we're moving and we're across the world to the other end, right? But like neighbors, community leaders, like teachers in my middle school or high school, like everybody was very embracive, and ultimately those are the things that I think my parents saw that I didn't see as a kid that was important,
Hmm.
right? But it's honestly a beautiful place, and I don't think that I would have, you know, um, I don't think things would have panned out if it wasn't a place that was very accepting. Uh, there was still a lot of racism and prejudice and stuff. It definitely was. I think Eugene used to be a town that was like a sundown town or whatever, where like after 5 p.m. You couldn't be outside if you're like colored or whatever it is. Up until like
Oh.
fairly recent times, right? So
Hmm.
it's very progressive, but it's not as progressive as you would think once you actually like live there. To the rest of the world, very like hippie and inviting and stuff. But when you live there, you start understanding the difference between prejudice and tolerance. Like you can still tolerate things even though you don't agree with something specifically, but you tolerate it, right? But if anybody asked me, hey, what was growing up there like, honestly, I think it was pretty cool. I got into stuff that I never really would have got into. I think if I was in a more urban area, like biking, joining a bike club, I was part of a
Hmm.
bicycle club at one point, which was like
Cool.
crazy weird, right? It's like you go to middle school, you have the different categories. You have preppy kids, you have the athletic kids, you have the nerds and the geeks and all that stuff, and then you have the bikers. It's like I literally. I did every single group, like as far as like group of friends growing up, I did every single one, except like the gothy and emo,
Hmm.
like circle and stuff. I didn't really do that, but like the preppy kids, I did everything because where I was from growing up in school, there was no such thing such as a preppy kid. There was no such thing such as a nerd or a geek or a jock or whatever. It's like I do not kid you. Where I grew up, and I guess the culture that a lot of Africans grow up in, the jocks hang out with the nerds the same way that the nerds hang out with like the geeks or like the troublemakers and stuff. You truly befriend somebody else because of their friendship, because of themselves, not because of their class where I'm from.
Hmm.
And I think that was one of the things that I learned when I moved to America, the whole aspect of how to be cool, you know what I mean? Because
Interesting. Yeah.
it's like you obviously worry about like what you wear, the shoes you got when you started school and all these different things and stuff, but where I was from, no one cared about that. It's like whether you're rich or poor, we're all friends. Like
Hmm.
the schools that I went to in Africa, like I was going to class with the kids and the families of like the president, right? And they're just normal people like myself. Now, when school is over, they get picked up in way nicer cars than I do. I agree. But as far as like our friendship and stuff, they're just regular people, just like myself. And you learn to treat people with respect, kindness, and not really pursue a status. But that is something that I learned when I moved to the United States at a very young age. Is the whole like a status and classism and what is being cool and preserving your reputation, all those different things. That was not really existent in the schools that I went to in Africa.
That's very interesting because I guess, yeah, for people there, it just seems like the norm. But I guess when you go somewhere where it's interesting to hear that perspective, where, like you're saying, you just went to school with the president, like none of that stuff is, everyone's just kind of the same versus now in the US, it's totally different. And
And
another
by the
thing
way,
that's interesting,
I should annotate this in there too.
yeah.
I was going to private schools in Africa, right?
Okay,
If
yeah.
if I was going to a public school, it might have been a little bit different. I'm not sure, right?
Hmm.
But I mean, going to school in Africa, I did go to a public school when I was like very young, obviously. But at that age, I don't really remember that much as far as like my classmates and stuff. But for most of my teen and youth, it was private schools.
Hmm.
So I, for anybody watching this, that's like, no, I had a completely different experience. Listen, I went to private schools in Africa.